All right, welcome fellow students. We are moving into a new Masechet, a new tractate of Mishnah, Horayot. This is a very interesting tractate. I wanted to give us something a little, we did the whole questions of Megillah and the question of reading different sections of Torah during our last section of Mishnah, to the deep, juicy judicial questions, the legal theory questions, which is a very well-developed topic in Jewish law, because we take our law seriously. Law as being something that is the foundation of our faith, and its application as being foundational to our people, our nation, and how we will continue. But what happens when there's an oops, right? What happens when there's a mistake? What is going to primarily discuss is what happens if the court gets it wrong. You ever ask that question to yourself, right? What happens if the Beit Din, oops, makes a mistake? And what happens if you follow their oops? What is the implication? Now, if you think this is a totally novel concept, then you haven't been paying attention to the book of Leviticus every time we read it each year, because this is one of the first topics that the book of Leviticus covers. It's in chapter 4, is what happens when the court makes a decision? What happens when the leaders of the community make a decision that is wrong? And that's what we're going to cover. So we're going to look at the introduction, although we don't normally do that, just because it's going to bring to mind a few texts from the Torah that maybe some of us have not always noticed as carefully every time we read through it each year, because the Genesis, we love the narrative of Bereshit, we love even some of the beautiful mitzvot that have to do with our rituals or have to do with our morality. But when we get to judicial mitzvot, most of us say, well, I'm not a judge, and turn the page. Not tonight. All right, so we are on the introduction. And Harriet, if you wouldn't mind reading, I wouldn't mind interrupting you.
Discusses sacrifices that must be brought as a result of unintentional sin.
All right, so that first word there, that adjective, is the most important. Unintentional sins. It's something that may not always, may not always be first in our mind, but there are the mezid and transgressions that are made bishgaga, right? The mezid means that you did it intentionally. I knew it was a sin, and I did it anyway, right? It's the idea of, I know it's Shabbat, but I really, really, really want a bonfire. And so I load up the fire pit, I light the fire pit, it's on Shabbat, and I know it's Shabbat, and you know what? I want to make that fire. That is an intentional sin. On the other hand, I want a fire. I think it's Sunday. I light the fire. My friend Shmuley looks over the fence and says, don't you know it's Shabbat? And I go, oh, darn it. Right? I forgot that it was Shabbat. Maybe I overslept. Who knows? I mean, it is possible to lose track of time. I know there have been days when I thought it was a Tuesday and it was actually a Monday. So I've never missed Shabbat. But it's possible that someone could, just in the moment, maybe they first wake up and they do something on Shabbat that they're not supposed to, just because they forgot in that morning moment. That's an unintentional sin. They did it by mistake. But there's also the question of, as we're going to see, unintentional because you were told wrong. And that's part of what we're going to get into here. So if you have an unintentional sin, and then you realize you sinned, the standard atonement is to bring a sacrifice. If you have an intentional sin, it doesn't work like that. It's to do atonement, but it is not, the sacrificial service is not designed to punish you by forcing you to bring a sacrifice because you made a sin. This is the part that so many people get wrong when they think about sacrifices, and when they think that the sacrifice, the blood of the sacrifice and all these things cleanses you of your sin and all. No. Sacrifice was intended to do. The sacrifice was intended to repair the breach in the relationship that came by your mistake, not by your direct intention. Right? It's sort of the equivalent of, you know, if I slap Yerach, if I pay him $50 for the slap, sorry, that's not an apology, right? It may be what the court forces me to do, but that's not an apology. That's maybe a punishment, but it's not an apology. if you do something deliberately, the way we repair the relationship is very different than if we're walking down the street and I trip and I go like that and hit him in the face. Very different problem that we've had. This is you've tripped, not you kicked. And that is something we got to keep in mind as we go through, because it's going to sound really, really weird occasionally. Is we're going to be saying that if somebody does it on purpose, they're exempt. That doesn't mean that they did it and they get away with it. It means they did it, and worse, because they can't fix it by just bringing a sacrifice. Right? You can't just send "I'm sorry" card when you did it on purpose. Well, think about how you would feel if someone hit your car. They were mad at you, or they hit your car because they just turned their eyes away from the road for a second. You would probably think the relationship was very different in those two cases, right? One, oops, and the other, I'm going to demand a different level of satisfaction for the intentional ramming of my car than I will for the accidental ramming of my car. And so too for God. You can't get out of it with an apology note if you did it on purpose. And the sacrifice is really the equivalent of an apology note. It is there as a physical means to show the intent and the desire for a reconciliation between us and God. It is not to wash away all sins, which again is something that gets completely misunderstood by many people who read the Bible without the benefit of commentary. Did you have a question? You looked like you were just about ready to say something.
No, I was thinking more today, but you were talking about the time of the temple, but I would think about, okay, what happens on today, in an extension when we are learning in Yom Kippur, like,
right? Because
some of the sins in Yom Kippur you do intentionally.
Exactly,
and you still you ask for pardon.
You do, but it is understood if you've studied Jewish law, and maybe someday we'll study Yoma, the section that deals with Yom Kippur. Maybe we'll see. Well, this one's fairly short, but we'll see. It's not meant to be a pardon reconciled with the person you did the mistake with. And as for things that we do between us and God that we did intentionally, yes, the process of tshuva is different. And just saying I'm sorry on Yom Kippur is not going to forgive, the fact that you went and I'm trying to think of something that's just between us and God. You deliberately bowed to an idol, right? The fact that you deliberately bowed to an idol, if you say sorry on Yom Kippur, but you haven't actually changed your life, and that the God is not forgiving you for that. That's not the way it works. It's not just a pro forma. If I say the right magic words, God forgives me.
Well, but Kol Nidre is kind of magic words to clean our.
So Kol Nidre is Kol Nidre. First of all, is only about the vows that we made. Different than transgression of the transgression.
You can do a vow that is offending to God. Like, for example, I don't know. If I save this test, okay, I promise I will go to church because my best friend that helped me studying, he's a member of that church.
Right. Or I'll donate $1,000 to tzedakah if you save my uncle's life, and all those sorts of things that people make. And you're right; those are vows that we should fulfill. But Kol Nidre is saying if you make a vow like that is in desperation or stupidity, held responsible for it because it was desperate and stupid. And B, there are many other vows that we make that are very minor. I swear to God, if I can just make it through today, then I will never be angry again. Right? I'll never lose my temper. And we forget about that within half an hour. But technically, if we say it in certain ways, it could be considered a vow or an oath. And those are the stupid things that we say the Kol Nidre is coming to help us not be held accountable for. But it's not fixing, for example, the oaths that we make to other people. Person Kol Nidre doesn't affect it at all. So Kol Nidre is a slightly special category. Plus, there's a whole argument of whether Kol Nidre is meant to be retroactive or proactive, of whether we're saying Kol Nidre about last year or whether we're saying Kol Nidre. And there's slightly different wording in the two different versions, but that's another conversation. You can look in the Machzor and listen to our Chazan to know which version we're using, or we can talk after class. Now we can go past the first sentence.
Verses 1 through 12 discuss sins of the high priest, priest, and verses 13 to 21 discuss the unwitting sins of the whole community of Israel.
Right. So sometimes the Kohen Gadol might make a mistake, And sometimes the entire kahal or edah will make a mistake, the whole community. Those in the two different categories in the Mishnah to discuss them.
According to the rabbinic interpretation of these passages, they refer to a case where either the high priest or the Sanhedrin, the court, permitted a certain action, which, when performed unwittingly by an individual, causes him to be liable to bring a sin offering. In other words, the court mistakenly permitted forbidden actions.
That's a pretty big oops.
Yeah.
Right now, we're going to get into the question of what happens if they say, there's no Shabbat anymore, right? Like just really gratuitous permission to do things that are obviously forbidden by the Torah. It's really dealing mostly with minor cases, with pieces of cases, where a court might make a decision where they got the calculation wrong. They forgot a piece of law, and then came to a conclusion that had they remembered it, they obviously would not have ever come to. So it's easier to make a mistake than you might think. And therefore, when people rely on the court's decision, it's easy for them to now unintentionally be transgressing the actual law because it's clear that the court made a mistake. Now, there are some cases where there is no right or wrong for the court to decide. That is to say, there are some cases where there isn't a perfect answer key that will tell you whether the court should rule A or should rule B, but it is a borderline case, and the court can choose whichever way makes the most sense for its understanding of the law within its community. And in those cases, it's not a question of doing it right or doing it wrong. But there are some cases where it's just duh, and it's not always obvious. Sometimes the duh is very simple, and it's just this tiny little piece that was left out of the calculation, and more egregious. But those are really the cases that we're dealing with here. Make sense, right? So it's not when they get it wrong, and I think it's wrong. It's when they get it wrong when on review, they as well would admit that they got it wrong. Right, that they can see where the error. It's like a math test. Sometimes wrong because you missed part of the information. You know, you subtracted when you were supposed to add. And when you look back over your work, you can see the mistake. But until you look back over your work, the mistake is there on the page. And some other questions are more like history questions. Why did the Civil War start? There's going to be a range of answers in that. It's not like a math question where the answer is just going to be 42. There's going to be a range of answers, and you can give better or worse answers maybe, but there's some flexibility in which way you answer that question. Make sense? So we're dealing with the math type problems here.
Verses 1 through 12, according to the rabbis, refer to a case where the high priest himself performs the sin, and verses 13 to 21 refer to a case where the majority of the community performed the sin. In both cases, a sacrificial bull must be brought either by the high priest or by the Sanhedrin. Have different technical names, which we'll learn throughout the tractate. The above is true with regard to all sins except accidental idol worship. If a court ruled that an action was not idol worship and the majority of the community performed the action, found that the court ruled wrongly, the court must bring a bull and a goat. This situation is referred to in Numbers. If an individual accidentally worshipped idols, he only brings a goat as a sin offering. And that situation is also referred to in Numbers.
All right, so when it's the whole community, it's bull and goat. When it's an individual, it's only a goat. That'll come up a little bit later on. And that's based on the verses in the Torah, which, of course, you are encouraged to look up at your own study.
With regard to an individual actually worshiping idols.
Accidentally.
Oh, I'm sorry. Accidentally worshiping idols. There is no distinction made between a high priest, a prince, or an individual. However, with regard to all other sins which are punishable if done with intent, extirpation, if a regular person performs them, he or she brings a she-goat or a female sheep, right? Sheep,
yeah.
Sheep.
Yeah, a big boat that, wears a dress.
If the sin punishable done by intent, if a regular person performs them, he or she brings a she-goat or a female sheep. But the prince brings a he-goat.
Okay, so again, this is based off their reading of the Torah. But the line I wanted to draw our attention here is that we're talking about sins that if you were to do them on purpose, the punishment would be karet, which is spiritual excision, right? To be cut off. Purpose. But if you did it by mistake, if it's in that category of sins, this is the offering you bring. Right? So that's, we're dealing still with mistakes, not intentional problems, but definitely a mistake, but it's of the category of sins that should you have done it by on purpose, then you would bring then it would be karet. Then if you do it by mistake, you bring the he-goat or the she-goat.
Okay, so what about the Jews today that are not like for observant, Shabbat observant?
Okay, so hold that question because we're going to get into, okay, my daughter's here to pick up my son, which means that he has been taken care of. Just what the face of the window means.
So what is more important, more value, the he-goat or the she-goat? Because I thought it was the she because reproduce. But for the context here, it looks like it's the he-goat.
So sometimes it's not a question of which was more valuable, because that I don't know off the top of my head, but sometimes it is a question of which did the halacha actually say was for which and the other. We can try to retroactively guess served one or the other, or we can simply say this is the way the halacha describes it, and without a value attached to it. So we'll leave it at that, rather than trying to figure out the price tag for the different species of, or different types of goat. To come back to the question of what about non-Torah observance today, and we're going to deal with that question when courts knowingly make certain types of decisions. So we'll come back to that. Mishnah 1:1. We're going to go ahead and jump into it now. Right, the rest of it just gives us an overview of the whole tractate, but since we're going through the tractate, we don't need the overview. But we did need to have that basic understanding of the topic.
First point. If the court ruled that one of the commandments mentioned in the Torah may be transgressed, and an individual proceeded and acted through error in accordance with their ruling, whether they acted and he acted with them, or they acted and he acted after them, or even if they did not act and he did act, he is exempt because he relied on the court.
Okay, so pronouns are annoying, right? But here we have a case. Let's say that the Sanhedrin has made a decision that it is okay to eat some new animal, right? And they're mistaken, that it turns out that that animal is actually a derivative species of pig or something. It's like one of those little miniature pot-bellied pigs or something, but they didn't think it was a pig because that didn't look like a pig.
Like the chicken today.
Please, I don't want to go in the chicken wars. Yes. So, but let's imagine they've actually made a mistake. But they made it with good faith. That is to say, they were trying to figure out whether this animal was kosher, and for some reason they missed one of the signs that it was not kosher, and they permitted it. And someone goes and says, okay, the court said it's kosher, and so they take and they eat the pig. The question is, do they have to wait for the court to eat the pig first? Or, that's what they mean of whether they acted and he acted with them, meaning the court is acting and then the individual is acting alongside of them. Or if he acted after them, meaning they did it and then next day he did it. Or even if he does it and they haven't done it. They made the announcement, but they haven't actually eaten it yet. In all of these cases, you are exempt. Now, you might have thought it was different, which is why the Mishnah is being exhaustive here, right? You might have thought, just because they said it's kosher, for example, right? It could be any topic, but we'll just use kasher because it's an easy one. Just because they said it's kosher doesn't mean they really think it's kosher. I'm going to wait until they eat it. And then once I see them eat it, then I'll believe them, right? There is a certain feeling of, proof in the pudding is in the eating kind of thing. That you got to have the person do it before I'll believe that they really mean it. Or vice versa. It could be that if they're going to serve it at their house and invite me to dinner, then I'll eat it in their house because I'm doing it with them. You might have thought that, but this is being very clear. No.
This is the Sanhedrin.
Yes.
The Sanhedrin I'm supposed to have great respect for. This is the high court. Wait until they actually do something.
Okay, so and that's the ultimate question of why are we being exempted for this? And the reason why I, Mr. Joe Schmo Jew, is being exempted for eating this thing, even though it turns out not to be, which, by the way, if I were to have made my own decision on, right, which Jews are allowed to make their own decisions, and we have done for most of the last 3,000 years. If I see this new animal and I think it's kosher because I have made a small mistake in how I analyze this animal, if I do that and then I realize, oops, it's not kosher, bring a sacrifice. Here, I don't have to bring a sacrifice. That's what's unusual, is there's going to be a sacrifice brought, by the way, by the court. But me, the individual, if I made the mistake, not because of my own decision, because of their decision that I was relying on, I am now exempt from bringing the sacrifice for a mistaken act. Well, it's logical, but you might think. That's one of those, that's a standard technical term in Jewish thinking. You might have thought, you might have said that it doesn't matter why I committed the sin. If I committed a sin, I committed a sin. Whether I was relying on the court or whether I was relying on myself, I have still transgressed. And the Mishnah is saying, no, that's not what the Torah is trying to teach us. The Torah is trying to teach us specifically in this section of Leviticus that if you are relying upon this decision, then you are trying to do the right thing by, as you put it, showing respect to the court.
The rabbis and the teachers.
Exactly.
So they know the law better than anyone else.
Plus, I am supposed to follow their rulings, right? That is another mitzvah, is to follow their rulings. And so how can I choose to act presumptuously and not follow their rulings when what they have said makes sense and just seems right? We're going to come back to that just seems right in just a moment. As always, I want us to realize that there are alternative interpretations of law or in terms of sin. And this is trying to say sin does not attach to you just because you did the act, right? Your intention can make a huge difference of whether you need different types of atonement. And in this particular case, because your intention was to honor the court that had made this ruling, indeed, that had you done it on your own, you'd be liable for a sacrifice. You are not liable in this case. Okay. However.
Point number 2, if the court ruled in error.
Right, same thing, same situation.
And one of them knew that they had erred, or a disciple who was himself fit to rule on matters of law.
Right, so we got one of the judges, and one of the other judges, for whatever reason, can see the mistake in the logic, but keeps his mouth shut. Right? Important later on of whether he speaks up, but for the moment, let's just imagine he keeps his mouth shut. Or one of the other people sitting in the courtroom, one of the other sages who isn't actually on the court, but should an opening arise on the bench, he would be on the court. He is qualified to be a judge. He's just not ruling in this case. And they also see the flaw in the ruling. The pig. I'm sorry, I jumped the gun, didn't I? I jumped ahead. Darn it.
That's right. Even if you knew that they had erred, right, and one of them proceeded and acted in accordance with this erroneous ruling, and he acted with them, or they acted and he acted after them, or even if they did not act and he acted, he is liable since he did not rely upon the court.
Right. He wasn't
a mistake
on their opinion, right? He knew their opinion was erroneous, that it was just false. And therefore, when he did it, he wasn't relying upon them. He was choosing to do it anyway. Now, why is he liable for a mistaken sacrifice? It's because he thought mistake wasn't that he did it unknowingly, because he knowingly did something that was wrong, which, as we said at the very beginning, sounds like an intentional sin. But it is classified as unintentional. You still with me? Mm-hmm. Because his unintentional sin was to believe that in a case like this, he should follow the court over his better judgment.
Oh, yeah, because also like follow the majority.
Well, you follow the majority to do right. You don't follow the majority off the cliff. Again, this is, remember, we're dealing with cases here of math type problems where there is a clear right or wrong answer that if you do the math right, you will get the right answer. And the majority of the court has done the math wrong for some reason. Somewhere in their equation, they left out a number. They skipped a decimal place. And somebody sitting there knows what mistake they made. They can't say, this pot-bellied, weird-looking mutant pig is kosher, because they've seen the signs, they know that it isn't. But they can't say, well, the court did it. will do it and say that they therefore didn't make a mistake. However, what we are saying, well, the court said it's okay, and I will show respect to the court, and therefore I will be fine eating the pig. Mistake, right? So they intentionally ate something they shouldn't have eaten because they unintentionally thought they had to obey this court even when the court was dead wrong. And that is where we're hitting an unintentional sin, not in the deed, but in the explanation for the deed. It's a little confusing here. And that's why I'm going over this a few times. Right? So their mistake wasn't in eating the animal because they intentionally ate the animal knowing it was wrong. Their mistake was justifying eating the animal because they were obeying the court, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to think you should do, which we already discussed in the first chapter, or the first section of the Mishnah. You should follow the court by and large. But where they made the mistake, which is why this turns into an unintentional sin rather than deliberate violation by eating the thing, was thinking that even if they were 100% certain the court had erred, that they should follow the court's ruling and permit themselves this thing anyway.
So during the Holocaust, the Jews were forced to eat whatever was given to them.
Not an issue. Not an issue. In life and death situations, this is not an issue at all. This is not a question of ruling or adjudication. If you're on a desert island, or if there's someone pointing a gun at your head, between where the doctor says you must eat bacon or else you will die. I don't know which doctor might say that. He'd be very popular among the Jews. Great prescription. Yeah, prescription, 5 pounds of bacon. Then yes, absolutely, you can eat it and you're not transgressing. And in fact, to refuse on the desert island to eat the only thing that's there, which is some wild pig, violation of Torah, right? To choose not to eat it and to starve yourself to death, that's a violation of Torah. So Jews in the Holocaust, Jews in other desperate circumstances, this is not an issue. If someone made an oops in a ruling, rather than in a desperate situation had to do something to survive. So,
thank you.
No problem.
Point number 3, this is the general rule. He who is in a position to rely upon himself is liable, and he who relies upon the court is exempt.
All right, so if you should have known better, then you are still liable for the unintentional sin offering. And again, remember, it's still an unintentional sin because your mistake was thinking that even though you should have known better, you should have relied on the court. That was your mistake. Not the eating, that was in purpose, but the relying on the court in the wrong circumstance, that was the mistake. Whereas the rest of us who were not fit to make that ruling, and therefore when we ate it, it was an unintentional mistake for us to eat it. However, I'm not liable for that unintentional mistake. The court is, because they were the ones who set me up to do it. So being more knowledgeable in this case brings greater responsibility, brings greater liability. Not knowledgeable, I'm just doing what the court says. And therefore, my transgression is on them. It's not on me. Make sense? Okay. Number 2, once you get this principle down, the rest of it goes much more easily. So if you feel like this is a little tricky, if you're getting it, we're going to be good.
So we're up to Mishnah 2.
Mishnah 2.
First point is, if a court ruled and later discovered that they had erred and changed their decision, whether they brought their offering or whether they did not bring their offering, if an individual proceeded and acted in accordance with their erroneous decision, Rabbi Shimon exempts him, and Rabbi Elazar declares his case doubtful. Okay, so let's go back to a case of a rabbi comes to the New World, and there is some new animal, new bird. No, turkeys are kosher. Yes, they are. Decide that.
But it's a complicated thing, but yes, they're kosher. But let's imagine there's some other bird, okay, right? There's American bird. It's American bird. And the first rabbi who looks at it thinks that it's kosher, maybe as he has a juvenile example of it. And so as he examines the crop and the gullet and all of that, it looks in the juvenile state like it's perfectly fine. And he's never seen the full mature version which grows an additional toe, or the toe moves and it grasps differently. So that there are signs that this is probably a predatory bird and therefore not kosher. But he sees a juvenile version of it and he permits it. And then later on, he or a later court sees the full-grown version and goes, "Oi, this cannot possibly be kosher." To Mr. Shmuley, who only heard about the first decision. And he goes on eating American bird after the second decision has been made. Well, so here we get two questions. One is to say he's exempt, right? Because he's just holding by the original decision. And as long as he knows the original decision, then why should he have to change his mind? Why would this be doubtful, though, according to the second opinion?
Because you should have listened to the news about it.
Maybe he has heard the second opinion. Maybe he should have updated his. Yeah, he needed to update his feed and see that another statement was made.
The person knows about the second opinion.
And that's why we come to part two. You're right on track. You're right on track.
Which case may be regarded doubtful. If he was at home, he is liable. But if he went abroad, he is exempt.
So if you're still living in the place where the announcements are being made, then yeah, even though you're relying on the court, you still have an obligation to be informed of what the court is continuing to say. You can't say, they said it's kosher, la, 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 la. I'm never going to hear again. Even though you're technically still relying on that first opinion, in the position to receive additional information. You can't just cut yourself off from more knowledge. So if you're home, even if you're not taking an active part in the court proceedings or not constantly reading halakhic journals and whatnot, you still are assumed to know. So if you are home and you find out later on that what had been permitted was actually now forbidden, you are responsible for the mistaken atonement, for an offering that to be brought because you unintentionally sinned. Even though you were relying on that first opinion, that coverage goes away when the second. But if you were traveling, right, so you get the opinion and then you go off into the American West, and while you're in the American West, you're far and away from all the rabbis and everyone else, and you're eating American bird because it's just so lovely, and then you come back and people say, "Oh, so did you hear the American bird's not kosher now?" And you go, "Oh, I've been eating it for the last 3 months." That's okay. Those 3 months, even if the rabbis had changed their mind the day after you left, those 3 months do not count as unintentional sins of your responsibility. Make sense? Right. Interestingly enough, we do have cases of the opposite, where we have things that were forbidden when people encountered the New World that then later were permitted, swordfish being the most famous example, which actually is exactly the case of a juvenile versus adult form, where people only saw the adult and not the juvenile and thought therefore they didn't have scales and weren't kosher, when in fact they do have scales in the juvenile, and the Talmud agrees that any fish that has scales at some point in its life cycle is still kosher. Part 3.
It does seem a little unfair, however. I'm working all day. I'm really busy. I got to pay attention to the court's decision every day to see if they change their mind on something that I'm doing. Come on, even if I'm home.
I mean, you actually have a responsibility to be a knowledgeable Jew.
But how can I keep checking on what they're doing and then my book?
Right. So one of the.
I think I understand what she means. It should be advertised, properly. In the city, in the synagogue,
right,
in the stores,
and
so you can't make a mistake.
And such decisions are, when a court issues a retraction, and actually says we had made this decision and now we are changing it, they are absolutely meant to promulgate this and make it very clear as far as possible.
Okay.
You should know, but this is also a reason why one of the things that is the hallmark of a good Jewish community is people talk Torah. Is that people share. Did you hear this happened? This, like, that's why you guys know about the chicken controversy, is because we share what's going on in the broader Jewish world. And that should be a topic of conversation, not only a topic of study.
That's because we come to listen and learn.
Because you're doing what you're supposed to do. But you notice that some of our conversations aren't just on the page, but some of our conversations are general, Jew talk.
Yeah.
All right, now part 3 is going to make it even.
He talks about the person who went abroad. Rabbi Akiva said, I agree that a person in such a case is nearer to exemption. And said Ben Azai to him, how does such a person differ from one who remains at home? He who remains at home is in a position to ascertain the facts, but the other was not in such a position. That's right.
Good logic. Nice. All right. 1-3. Now we're going to get to the big stuff.
If the court ruled that an entire principle has to be uprooted, that, for instance, that the law concerning the menstruant is not found in the Torah, or the law concerning the Sabbath is not found in the Torah, or the law concerning idolatry is not found in the Torah, they are exempt.
Who is exempt?
We
are
The court.
the court?
Okay. Remember, this is back at the introduction. What does exempt mean in this case?
For bringing
From
sin
bringing
to the
sacrifice.
Exactly. They still are wrong,
Oh, okay, I see what
right?
you're saying.
They are still wrong,
I see the logic.
but they have not committed the transgression of unwittingly permitting that which should be forbidden. That was what Leviticus was talking about, was where you make an oops moment. And what this Mishnah is trying to tell us is that you don't make oops when you uproot a pillar of Torah, right? If you say there is no Shabbat, everyone should know better, right? You don't need to be a halachic genius.
So why they are
So
exempt?
why are they exempt?
Ah,
Right, good
yeah.
question.
Because it's not an oops. Bring the oops offering.
So they started.
But yeah, they're still liable for their decision,
Okay, fine.
right? Remember, this is all about, do they bring the oops offering for the bishkaga, for the unintentional act, for unwittingly, that was
They are
prohibited.
clearly guilty for intentional.
Not intentionally, right? Intentional is going to come later, right? But the question here is, the court makes the decision. There is no such thing as Shabbat. Me, lowly Jew Shmuley, and I say, well, the court said there's no such thing as Shabbat, so I guess there's no such thing as Shabbat. Who's responsible for my unintentional sins now? The
You.
court or me? Me.
Yeah.
Right? For the oops case, where the court said, that the little pot-bellied pig was kosher, who was responsible? The court. Offloading the responsibility when they make a giant blunder, then they are not responsible for an oops sacrifice. Still be, if I was following their directions. And in fact, I'm not supposed to follow the directions, because I'm supposed to be able to notice when they have uprooted something that is fundamental to Torah. Murder is okay. No, I'm not going to run out and kill my neighbor, right?
So in
It's-
this case,
For your
they
own
will
judgment.
correct to the court.
It depends on what they're permitting, right? There's different types of sins that could be being permitted. So then whatever action they're doing would have the normal punishment to go along with that action. But oops, right? There is such a mistake that is so bad that it isn't, I forgot the sign. This is like, I'm trying to think if there's a parallel in the math test metaphor that I've been using. This is like saying, what's 2 + 2? And the answer you give is squirrel. Right? If you give an answer that is totally outside the realm of possibility, right? How can you answer 2 + 2 as squirrel? Then clearly you're not doing the problem right. I mean, you're not even getting the numbers wrong. You're just not even playing the same game. You are looking somewhere else for answers other than math, or in this case, other than Torah. Now, part 2 is going to try to give us a little bit of a gradation here of what is an oops and what is an uproot. And let's go and head through 2. It might make it a little bit clearer.
However, they ruled that a part of a commandment was to be annulled and a part fulfilled, they are liable.
Okay, so again, liable means for an oops offering, right? So we're going to get some examples, but if they try to say that part of Shabbat isn't really an issue, really now they're making an oops, right? Because now it's up to interpretation. And the question is, there are interpretations that are wrong, and then there are interpretations that are open. Interpretation that is wrong, like you can burn a fire on Shabbat, oops, right? Because that's not. If they say there is no Shabbat, that wasn't an oops, that was a total uproot. So we got sort of like the category or hierarchy here, right? You got uprooting, you've got oopsing, and then you've got judgment calls are judgment calls, you follow the court. Are generally, if you don't know any better, not your fault. The court eats it if they're the ones who made the mistake. But in the meantime, you do what the court says. And uprooting, that is totally outside the category of mistakes. Well, it's a mistake, but it's not handled as an oops category. It's handled as a you're uprooting Torah category. Examples, and maybe that'll help.
They said, the law concerning the menstruant occurs in the Torah. But if a man has relations with a woman, day corresponding to a day he is exempt.
That's he is exempt.
Oh, he is. Oh, it's
really, a semicolon would be there, would be better.
Is that what it is?
Right.
Oh, okay.
So what is an example of this? Right. Well, we talked about if they said there's no such thing as nida. Right. There's no such thing as the separation between men and women that occurs during the monthly cycle. If they say there's nothing at all in the Torah about that, and you don't have to follow any of those laws, uprooting the Torah. But if they say yes, there are those laws, but if a woman has seen a drop of blood and therefore she's waiting one more day to see whether there's going to be more, and she doesn't, and in the meantime, in that waiting period with her, that's okay. Well, that's not what the Torah says, and it's certainly not what rabbinic law says. Right? That was, they made a mistake, because no, Torah and rabbinic law says that if she sees a drop, you have to wait a day. And the abnormal time. Right, not during the normal monthly cycle, but in the middle of the cycle, one drop. This is going to be the start of a new cycle. See if this is going to be a regular discharge. They say, no, you don't. That's an oops. If they say there is no such thing as nida, as any concern whatsoever over the monthly cycle, that's an uproot. This is a big. There's also one that may be difficult to always see, right? Because we like it to be clear that if someone uproots something that we think is clear of a larger concept, we think that they're rejecting the entire thing. But what the rabbis are saying here is no. If they uproot, sorry, that's probably the one who's the confusing term. If they remove part of a larger structure of halacha, like Shabbat, and they say fire is okay, or the menstruant, and they say, one day it's okay. That is an oops rather than a full uproot.
Well, and like, I see that with the conservative and the Orthodox, but like, they don't follow that.
Let's get the last few examples, and then we'll take it to the modern times.
He's exempt. Does that mean from bringing a sin offering or from bringing an offering? What is he exempt from?
Yes.
He's exempt from bringing an offering.
Right, which means they are mistaken. Who relies? Oh, sorry, wait. Which exempt?
Well, both of them say he's exempt with the woman or with the Shabbat.
Oh, that means that the court has ruled exempt.
Whether it's a big ruling or a small ruling.
No. The court is ruling.
Yeah.
The actual Torah rabbinic law. In the case, well, read part B. It's easier for people because a lot of people are unfamiliar with the laws of nida.
Concerning Shabbat occurs in the Torah. Brings anything from a private domain to a public domain, he is exempt. Okay, so in the Torah, it says not to move and carry things, and the rabbinic law reinforces that very explicitly and in great detail. But if a court said, no, if you do it, you are not liable. For what? For breaking Shabbat. I don't have to bring it off. Right. So in this case, exempt means you have not broken the mitzvah. Right. That's what the exempt at the end of A, B, and C means. That's the court ruling. Something. Right. Well, exempt from punishment. Not committed a sin. No, you just have not committed a sin. Right. Which, of course, we know is wrong. Made a mistake, and they're using gratuitous examples. Right. It's hard to imagine a court that would make these mistakes, but they are using them to drive home a point. Let's take the last example, and then we'll see what that point really is trying to be. The law of idolatry. They say the law of idolatry. The law of idolatry occurs in the Torah. Meaning, don't do idolatry. Don't do idolatry. He bows down to an idol. He is exempt. That's their imaginary, erroneous ruling. You do idol worship, but if you're only bowing, is that such a big deal? Imagine a court said that. The court is liable, and that is
the man who follows the court would be unintentionally sinning by their ruling. That is different than if they said, issue. Do whatever you like with idols. That's not what they're saying. They're just saying this particular part, which should be, yes, isn't in the Torah. That still counts as an oops.
And it says, if some matter escapes the notice of the congregation, it says in Leviticus, some matter, but not the entire principle.
Exactly. If there's a davar, right, that you make a mistake on, there's a davar that is an element that you're confused about, or that you overlook, or that somehow you make a mistake on, or you simply erroneously think that there's some other matter that supersedes it. You know, for example, we talked before about life-threatening situations where you can eat whatever you need to eat to stay alive. Imagine someone said, well, it's not only life-threatening situations, it's also just, you know, or parnasah in terms of your livelihood. So if it's important for your job to eat other things, I can imagine somebody saying that. And the answer would be, that's not uprooting kashrut. Right? And that's different than if someone said, kashrut shmashrut.
Yeah.
You know, the Torah doesn't care what you eat at all, eat whatever you want. Okay, so into the modern world. It's tempting to think that want to uproot entire principles of the Torah. Well, I mean, so what would often be bandied about would be to say the Reform movement wants to uproot concepts. And I will agree that there were times in the early days of the Reform movement, back in the 1880s and such, when they produced platforms and statements, absolutely sounded like they were trying to cancel entire sections of the Torah. As a movement, especially today, they do not say that. Vehemently disagree on the details from ourselves, and in many places we vehemently disagree on details with the Orthodox. But they don't say there shouldn't be Shabbat. They just say it doesn't matter if you light fire on Shabbat. They agree that there is Shabbat, and they try to celebrate and honor Shabbat in many of ways that are similar to ours, and in many ways that are different than ours. But they have not said Shabbat is canceled. They don't close shul on Saturday. I mean, or Friday night. They don't say there is no Shabbat. They just say Shabbat doesn't mean no fire. Now, do I still consider that to be an oops? Of course. Right? I think the Torah is very clear. No fire on Shabbat. But they are not trying to uproot the concept of Shabbat. They are simply interpreting and ruling on the details of Shabbat in a way that I don't think Torah supports.
So individuals in the conservative or reform movement, we are exempt for anything because we follow the core of the movement. So whatever the decision reform movement that which direction we follow, we are exempt.
Okay, so this is then where you get into a question of the responsibility that leadership has in any religious community. But Judaism makes it explicit, which is the sages, the rabbis, the courts, wherever you are in any generation, the teachers, that if they get it wrong, responsibility more than those who follow their rulings unwittingly. There was actually a mistake. So, you know, to give you an example, I know of many Reform and conservative people, more Reform than conservative in these examples, as young adults or in college or as adults. They had no idea that there was any laws about the relationship between men and women during the monthly cycle. It just had never been discussed. Right? Even though the conservative movement absolutely still talks about it and still makes rulings about it, many of which are online in the Rabbinical Assembly website, because their religious education finished when they were in their bar mitzvah age, we weren't exactly discussing it with them. And their parents certainly weren't discussing these topics with them. And so by the time they're young adults, they've never even heard of these things. Our responsibility to try and carry them through and to actually teach them. And it's very frustrating. And not only that, you know, I've met Reform people who had no idea there was a prohibition on separation between meat and milk. Right? It just had never been taught to them. It's not that they were willingly trying to violate it. Up in their school. because the schooling had focused on other goals, not bad goals, just other goals. And so there is an intentionality to uprooting something that is obvious and a whole unit that this Mishnah is trying to make clear. And this Mishnah was written at a time, through times, when there would be vehement arguments of Shabbat observance and many other factors of life. But nobody was actually trying to say, we're just yanking out the entire engine of Torah, this whole component of Torah. They were just arguing that the Torah never says that explicitly. Or the Torah didn't mean it when it said that. And you'll hear people, for example, on the meat and milk thing, who will argue now, the Torah never meant that you shouldn't eat any meat with any milk. The Torah only meant a particular act of eating the milk with the cow, the kid with the mother's milk. That's the only thing that you'll hear people who will argue that passionately. I mean, they really like their cheeseburger. To be so. They're not trying to uproot Torah. They're simply not a decision that follows the pattern of tradition and halakha that goes back more than 2,000 years. Because they hate Torah? No. It's not because they even hate rabbinic Judaism per se. It's simply that to their mind or their community's interpretation, that isn't what God wanted when God gave us the Torah. And that is a very different attitude and one that we have to respect even while we disagree. And this is one of the fundamentals of Jewish pluralism in my mind. And one of the things that we often struggle to hold on to, which is when someone agrees with us in something that we think is blindingly obvious, we have to stop and ask, are they actually attacking Torah? Are they actually attacking Judaism? Or are they just, from my perspective, mistaken about how to read and interpret this and what to do with the text? And if the answer is, from my perspective, they're mistaken, but they love Torah, they just don't think that's what it means, then they are not in the category of those who want to uproot it. Those who are making, again, from my perspective, a big oops. If we can look at each other as saying, all right, they made an oops. Not in the, remember, the border cases, but in things that we only in things that we think are really obvious, like barbecue on Shabbat, where the Torah is really clear about no fire on Shabbat. It's a big oops, right? But they still sing on Shabbat. They still pray on Shabbat, who are Shabbat haters. These are not people who are rejecting God. These are not people who are trampling the Torah. These are people who are making, from my point of view, mistakes. And we make mistakes. And I know from my point of view, the Orthodox make mistakes. And I know from the Orthodox point of view, we make mistakes. But as long as we still say, together, even though you made that mistake and they made this mistake and I made this mistake, because no one's perfect. But that's why I think the rabbis set the threshold for uprooting so high, denying the entire category before they can be considered to be uprooting from the Torah. If they are interpreting the category for attaching themselves to the Torah, they are still trying to be connected to God through the Torah. The job of it, that's making a mess of it, from my perspective, I'm a hater of Torah or a hater of God. That's not where they are.
Is it a good example of interpretation of the Torah in a more literal way?
Well, one type of interpretation that moved them outside of the normal rabbinic interpretation, rabbinic Judaism. The Karaites, if you don't know, were from the 600s, 700s, 800s CE, and they wanted to only read Tanakh. They didn't want any Midrash, no Talmud. They only wanted pure Tanakh. And we still called them Jews for centuries. We said they were mistaken Jews, but we still called them Jews, and we would engage with them and we would debate with them. And in fact, much of the scholarship on Jewish grammar and Hebrew literacy came because of with them, rather than just saying that's not what the Mishnah says. We really upped our game when it came to Hebrew scholarship in order to be able to argue on their turf. In the end, it sharpened Judaism much, and there are some that argue that their emphasis of Torah study and Tanakh study was one of the things that led to the great influx of Mefarshim, of the great commentators, of Rashi and the others, at the Torah as a gateway to learning, not only as the halakha, as a way to living. And so we have a lot to owe from that engagement. And we called them Jews for centuries and centuries and centuries until the differences finally became too insurmountable. Jews. Mistaken, but still Jews. People are quick to write each other off these days, too quick to write each other off. Just one last point, then we'll wrap it up. I don't know whether you noticed, but there was a big event recently where a group of Jews came together who were Reform to do Treifa Banquet 2.0. The Treifa Banquet. You know the Treifa Banquet? So back at the end of the 1880s, the first graduating class of the Hebrew College, I'm trying to remember whether it was Hebrew University, right? They had a big feast, right? And they serve shellfish and frog legs and no pork, but and it wasn't done as a intentional statement of rejecting kashrut. One of the things that triggered the eventual creation of the conservative movement. Because there were many scholars and teachers and rabbis who were there when this is no, guys, what are you doing? Right? This is too much. Other things, especially some of those early platform statements, was what movement and the founding of JTS and all of the things that became our movement. Well, just I believe it was last week, there was a group that decided to get together and do another Treifa banquet. This time, eat things. So everything at the banquet wasn't kosher. Everything on the table wasn't kosher in order to show that now it wasn't that they were saying that kashrut wasn't important. They weren't saying that kashrut isn't in the Torah. They were interpreting that it isn't about just forbidden animals and forbidden things. There are other concepts of social justice and other things that need to be thought of when we are eating. As one of them said, I would rather eat something that is treif, produced than something that is kosher but unethically produced. Again, they weren't trying to say kashrut is a null concept. They were trying to say the way others are doing kashrut is empty and not fulfilling the Torah's broader goals. I disagree with them. I agree that that kosher food should be produced ethically, but I disagree with the whole kosher part of that. Kosher does also still mean not putting pork in my mouth. Trying to say kashrut is gone, they were trying to say this is what kashrut really means. And there I disagree. An example of a very extreme version of looking almost like they are getting rid of kashrut, but in fact they are still trying to use it in a very different way than I interpret. I agree with, please do not go get their menu as your shopping list.
I saw that on Facebook.
A big lot of rounds on social media, yeah. The members of the event were Reform people, yes. But that doesn't mean that it was sponsored by the movement. It was part of the movement.
Private people, not like a graduation.
No, it wasn't a graduation. No. It was, they were trying to make a statement about farming and ethical food production and all of these things. And so that was why they deliberately got things that weren't kosher in order to show that they thought the Torah was emphasizing how we eat in higher values than just which animal it came from. But I also have to see that they are not trying to get rid entirely of the idea that God cares about what we eat. They are simply trying to reinterpret what tameh and tahor, of impure and pure, means when it comes to food. So it's an interesting, like I said, extreme example where they are still within Torah because they are pointing to Torah as their justification. They are not pointing to Torah as being wrong, as being something to reject. They're just interpreting it wildly differently than I would. Good. All right. We will pick up with Mishnah 4 next week.
So I have a question. What about the